actually, so just like a more general question too, just because I was thinking about this the other day. What do you think like the origin of viruses in general is? Because viruses are not. I think there's debate among people in biology whether they're living completely or not. How different they are from animals, and that they require a host where animals don't. Um, so
So
where do you think? Yeah,
yeah, yeah. There's the thing of where did they come from, in a sense of also, were they the predecessors of all the other things, or did they lose some functions and come from other things? And I actually don't know, and I don't have much of an opinion on it. But and then the question is, are they living or not? Which again is, for me, is irrelevant. And it's funny because it might even be generational. Well, certainly when I learned it, they were not alive, because to be alive, you had to be able to replicate, or replicate yourself, or mate and create progeny yourself. And the virus couldn't. It absolutely needs something else to allow it to multiply. Um, but uh, overall, does it really matter? I mean, for me,
yeah,
it's a definition that makes humans feel more comfortable with whatever they need to accept. But the virus will do it either way. It'll continue to replicate. I think it's just the lines are too blurred in biology to be able to separate things in that way, in what is alive and what is not alive, in what is one species and another. So, viruses, I think, are just fascinating because they are this minimal piece of information that allows itself to spread, but on its own, it's inert. And then if we go a step further, there's even prions, right, which are proteins that somehow can become now infectious and cause change. And those are not even, there's no genetic material there. So who knows where to draw the line?
yeah. Well, no, because I just asked because I think like there's some people who have thought that like if we can understand how to almost like create a virus, like there's been tests to. I know there's been research in like figuring out how life began and
Mm,
how if there's a way to create like a DNA strand,
yeah,
and like could we actually just create life in a lab from basically like things that like aren't alive? If there's a way we can understand like
yeah.
where viruses came from, can we? Yeah,
And I think that, so for RNA viruses, which are the simplest of viruses as well, I think there's that interesting point of, if you take an RNA virus, it's just a little bit of RNA that replicates thanks to taking proteins from the cell, and then it encodes for basically its genome and its shell to propagate. But then there's viroids, which don't even have the shell. It's literally just RNA that replicates, right? And so that's when you start to get to then at the very origins of life, or organisms. We imagine in the primordial soup, it was these sort of self-assembling RNA structures that then found a way to kind of cut themselves or replicate and make more of themselves. And then you get very close to, well, that's just one step away from virus, right? So it comes to the question of, are they at the origin? So maybe. I mean, I haven't thought a lot about it. I imagine yes, probably in the very early forms, they looked like what today's RNA viruses look like, but certainly the ones that we have today have nothing to do with what was around before. Because then there's a whole exchange of genetic material back and forth that continues throughout time between organisms.
is there a way to trace like the evolution of viruses similar to like human beings? Is there evidence for like simpler versions of viruses like thousands and thousands of years ago, and like now they've become different?
Well, we can't. I mean, we don't have a lot. We can't go very far back and actually have true examples of viruses, especially RNA, because that doesn't even live much longer than a few seconds out of, in the environment. But the same techniques used to the phylogenetic and molecular clock techniques used to try to piece back genetically the DNA-based organisms work for the viruses themselves. So we can see that for all of the viruses, these do break down more or less into families, genera, etc., the way the rest of taxonomy does. Um, so it suggests that they do have common ancestors that we can imagine go back X number of years, but it all becomes much blurrier because viruses also have there's a lot of evidence of genetic exchange and recombination and things that happen that make those phylogenetic trees not as convincing when you start to try to get too far back. Um,
And those gene exchanges and changes all happen in hosts, right? Like there's no interaction of, because I guess like in order for the virus to change, it has to interact with the host somehow, and then like make a mistake or like have like a like essentially like all the changes a virus has to happen within a host,
yeah, for
right? Like that's
so the virus, unlike all the other things like bacteria or bigger, is that they absolutely need to copy themselves and to be active. They need the host. They need to be in a host because most of the proteins that are required for replication and translating and making proteins, all of that do not exist in the virus. And so it has to hijack the host machinery and just have the host, in addition to doing what it's doing, make things required by the virus.
how do you think like this might be a silly question, but how do you think viruses have survived for so long? Because it seems like if they need a host to survive, then at least like at least one like copy of a virus has to exist in the host at all times for it to maintain itself. Because if at any time a virus is not in the host, then it would die off. Correct.
Yeah.
So they always have to have.
Well, they always need to be in a host, either replicating or chronic in some form or another. Um, and that's a good philosophical question. I suppose the other way of asking is how many viruses haven't made it and have disappeared over time because of that exact reason. There just hasn't been enough. There haven't been enough hosts to maintain them. It all depends also on what is the lifestyle that ultimately each virus has chosen. I'm doing a lot of personification here, but it's true.
Yes.
Like, there are some viruses that rather than go fast and furious and replicate and get out, but it needs to be very close to another host in the time, in the time that one sneezes, or it can be something more like a sexually transmitted persistent infection where you're not necessarily going to come in contact with other hosts that often, but you're sticking around in the host long enough for that to occur, right? So it's
Right.
viruses are ultimately challenged with that, and the ones that win are the ones that over time have managed to evolve and the mechanisms or the lifestyles required to survive. But if a host changes, or in anything, if the host changes in distribution, in some kind of behavior method, it can alter dramatically the the niche in which the virus exists, and that might be the downfall of the virus, but it might open a new niche for other viruses.